Hey guys, it's Mike, and today's video is a conversation that I got to have with Elias Dummer formerly from City Harmonic. We had a great chance to talk about worship and what that means in an online environment, and Platonic dualism, and a whole bunch of other cool stuff. So I wanted to just record this little bumper and do it as an introduction, and let you guys know that yeah, we're going to be doing a lot more of this in preparation for the rewrite of Online as It Is in Heaven. So enjoy the interview. Right, I think, are we live? There we go. Sweet. Hi, how's it going?
Good, man. I'm excited to chat and
Yeah. Just to explain for anyone who ends up watching this video, I'm not really sure of the like timeline of events, whether it was like me liking one of your posts or you liking one of my posts first or whatever. But I remember connecting on one of your reels and just thinking this guy really seems to have like just a finger on the pulse of what worship nowadays looks like, and might have some like valid opinions and perspective that I don't on like what worship looks like in an online setting, or now that
Mm.
online's even an option. And I had absolutely no idea, just based on your reels, that you were the lead singer from City Harmonic.
Oh,
When I found that, I was like, oh wow, no, I just kind of changes things. So thank you very much for your time. I imagine you are a busy guy, so I really appreciate the hour, and the offer to talk. So
super fun. Honestly, I love stuff like this. That's kind of why I've been doing the Reels thing. I've always been a little bit of a geek with a tendency towards the deep end, and I don't mean that in a pretentious way. I mean in the kind of slightly obnoxious way, probably. So,
yeah, no worries. I was actually talking with my brother, so he is a huge fan. I have a
oh
twin
wow,
out in New Brunswick, and his faith journey involves a lot of the City Harmonic music, like because he came in late, like after high school into college and stuff.
yeah,
And I was like, yeah, so I'm interviewing Elias. Like, no, we could do the interview. We're twins, he'll never
just
know.
just swap out. That's
I
funny.
know. So yeah,
That's amazing.
thought it was funny. Yeah, so I'll just dive right into the questions. Kind of the
Sure.
premise of it is prior to COVID and everyone kind of diving in feet first to online at church and stuff out of necessity. I wrote a book called Online as It Is in Heaven. It was kind of
Hmm.
like my first crack at what theology and the internet would be, and how the church is and isn't using things properly and stuff like that. And the book always did good. Like it was just by no means like a bestseller or anything like that, but I was always happy with its performance. And that was about a year before COVID hit, and then every single part of that book got stress tested throughout the last 2 years.
Right.
I'm like, oh, I need to do a rewrite, like something fierce, because
Yeah.
I don't think, like, most books don't get that kind of trial by
Yeah.
fire to
Right.
see everything work. And so I've always wanted to be transparent online. I put a disclaimer on the book saying, hey, COVID changed sections of this book that I personally as an author don't agree with anymore, because I didn't think about how that would play out. Because, like, how do you think about what happened during COVID? Like, it was all kind of hit us by
Pretty
surprise.
unprecedented as far as our.
Yeah. So I'm hoping to rewrite the book probably in a year, but I want to do a bunch of these interviews with people who are kind of like boots on the ground, dealing with the realities of doing both ministry and corporate worship or church services online. So I figured, yeah, you'd probably have some insight on that. So
Yeah,
I'll
yeah.
uh, I'll put you in the hot seat and hopefully not get you too uncomfortable. But
No, this is great.
but yeah, how did worship change for you during the pandemic? So you're, a worship artist. You write songs for use in worship settings. Do you lead worship at your church currently, or how does that work?
Yeah, so I lead at the church where we are now. During the pandemic, I was actually at a different church. It was a church that I had sort of helped to co-plant, and so it was an intriguing season to say the least. I think the biggest gap is one that I've actually been talking about lately with somebody else, but I think we online is ultimately sort of presentation with delayed community. So
Hmm.
there's no sense of which, except for say live streaming, and even then, it's thinly veiled presentation as community. Online interactions are almost always presentive as opposed to participatory. Even if they can be participatory, it's over time rather than in the moment. So it's difficult to create a sense of instantaneous community outside of like gaming, let's say,
Yeah.
right? So like live streaming to me, while it has sort of the sense of consuming the content or engaging the content and that sort of thing, you don't get the same sort of instant feedback loop that exists in a sort of in-person service.
Yeah.
And that that gap in my own for myself was very difficult to navigate. I found that very painful because I enjoy making music, I enjoy playing music, I enjoy producing. I've made records for years, but the idea of sort of worship as essentially the development and presentation of content for people to consume in their living rooms, and that's what churches were doing, was really hard for me, and I found it really hard in our own context. It was just a really strange and difficult transition.
Yeah, that's something that I pick up in the book, and that it really focused on kind of content generation and proliferation. This whole idea that the internet's the new Gutenberg press,
Mm-hmm.
but where that kind of fell apart was, yeah, you have that gap, and it's funny. The thing missing from the book is that gap. It's like, yeah, if there's, what does it mean to have community with a time delay? What does it mean when
Yes.
that time delay is more than just 30 seconds of the realities of broadcasting?
Yep.
Like when you're out of necessity to do what you need to do. Otherwise, we face this at our church where we're just running our creative department into the ground,
Mm-hmm.
trying to keep up to the amount of kind of live stuff.
Oh
And
yeah.
so that, the need for pre-recorded content to serve in the to be parts of the worship experience every Sunday was by necessity needed, or else you're just going to
Oh
burn
yeah.
through
It
people.
just wasn't going to happen otherwise. And I think the thing is, it's obvious, but maybe not without saying, that not all churches were equally prepared for this. I mean, you
Oh,
take an organization like Bethel, who's been building their own content arm and media arm for 10 years. Well, while this would have been hard for them or Elevation, it certainly was less hard than it was for a mom pop without the skilled services,
yeah.
to sort of become a media producer overnight. And so that meant a lot of bumps and bruises along the way, and it's fine. And our church was luckier than most churches our size
Yeah.
in that we have a lot of media skill under one roof. But nevertheless, it was still just really hard because, and I actually think it's interesting because it is on one hand a conversation about the online versus the in-person experience, but that gap actually also points to a little bit of a theological gap we have, I think, particularly within wider evangelical circles, where we kind of embrace a sort of de facto dualism, if you will, where we don't consider often enough the sheer humanness of the human beings that make up a congregation. And so
Yeah.
our worship, our sermon, or any facet of the service is ultimately, even in person, unless we're intentional to do otherwise, is reduced to the production and consumption of information or content, as opposed to saying, hey, these are human beings with brains, and we're starting to know how those brains work. There's a lot more we don't know than there is that we do know, but we're
Yeah.
starting to know a little bit about how that works. And that's one of the downfalls. I mean, Carey Nieuwhof talks about this like a madman, doesn't he? And it's one of the things, if I ever sat Carey down for coffee, I'd poke him on this because I'm like,
Oh,
I
I'm dogging him right now because we connected at the beginning of the at that pandemic, and I asked him in a comment section, and he did reply. He's good for that kind of stuff.
oh yeah, no,
But
he's
just
down for
like what are the theological implications of what we're about to do? It's like theology is going to have to catch up in that sense, and every reformed bone in my body just lost it and just like, no,
well, I
that's
mean,
not it.
even just setting theology aside for a second, the sheer, like, this is kind of what's problematic about Zuckerberg and the metaverse too, is you have this sense in which, can we create avatars which satisfy our brain's own desire for physical interaction with other humans? And so far, it doesn't look like it.
Yeah, because
That's there's too much happening.
yeah, the metaphysics don't quite line up. The physics do, like, because you can watch a video of someone skydiving and feel it in your feet, that sensation of dropping, because your
Right.
brain knows what that looks like.
Right.
And yeah, I don't know if that'll ever click up, but that kind of brings me to the next question. So what's bare minimum church service then? Because like we know where we're headed, I think, even if it's a bit kind of murky, but we understand that like online's not going to go away without a fight.
Right.
But if it's going to be embraced, what is it being embraced from? Like what was church if we're going to
Yeah.
redefine church?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess in my head, and a little bit of what I'm doing online and what have always been doing, although I didn't quite have language for it, was I've always been a theology nerd. I've long been a science nerd, although in both cases I'm tactically an amateur. Um, I, for me, I've long sort of seen what I'm doing as that exact exercise, as sort of reconstructing worship in an age where we have a
Mm,
lot of theological questions about what it is that we're doing. And so I guess, I mean, if you want to look at a bare minimum, in my mind, we could look to churches planted in the third world or cultures which weren't predominantly Christian. And at the end of the day, corporate worship is characterized by corporate prayer. So the idea of minimally Christians gathering to pray for one another and encourage each other is fundamental to the gathering. I'd go further. I'm a bit more sacramental. I would say, like, if I had to choose between a 45-minute sermon, and I'm being particular here, a 45-minute sermon and communion, I would take communion, because discipleship is ultimately significant enough in, I think, practical Christian living,
yeah,
that communion is something that is unique to the corporate gathering, that sermons aren't even the most effective way of doing what they try to do. So there's a
yeah,
lot there's a lot to be said in the thing we take for granted as like a content delivery system, like we were talking about earlier,
yeah.
as opposed to sort of what is it in worship service that is by definition communal and sacred and that sort of thing. And I think we've kind of had that. We've not been thinking about it that way for a long time.
Yeah, I wrote a short poem on that, kind of in response, because it had been bugging me for a while, and the language finally just kind of clicked. Because when we were starting to come back and people were allowed to gather again, and there wasn't restrictions, and particularly when the masks dropped
Right.
on the thing, it was like a script was handed to most pastors who were going to be reopening the church, and everyone said the exact same line: "There's just something about meeting together." I'm like, yeah, it's orthodoxy, like
Yeah.
meeting together is the church part. And it's like, and if
Right.
we're going to redefine that, it's not just something, like it had a rich like history and definition before that we weren't doing before, obviously. And that's why it caught us unprepared, and why it feels so, nostalgic and weird to kind of come back to that, because
Mhm.
we didn't value it before, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's true. And I think if we just design our services in such a way, I mean, if you look at, I mean, you might know, if you know about City Harmonic, you might know I've spent a lot of time in kind of ecumenical conversation.
Yep.
So if you look at the Greek Orthodox service, which is quite long, sermon is not the most significant portion of time. I mean, the liturgy itself is long.
Right.
Eucharist is long, right? If you look at the Catholic services, the same goes. If you look at Anglican, so generally speaking, in the mainline and traditional apostolic denominations, you're
Hmm.
talking about a service which might be anywhere from 45 to 90 minutes, depending. In the Orthodox Church, they can go 3 hours, but the sermon itself, the idea of the application within the corporate gathering, is usually no longer than 15, anywhere from 12 to 25 minutes, right? And
Hmm.
the homily is sort of how it's approached. And within Protestantism, and understandably so, we've sort of made preaching into a sort of substantial centerpiece.
Yeah.
But but I think there's a lot to be lost in doing so. Not that it's not important. I'm a preacher myself. I love this stuff. I could totally sit through hours of NT Wright and live,
Hmm.
have no regrets.
Well, you don't have a choice with that guy. You're gonna sit through hours of it,
Yeah,
right?
I know, but my point is that I enjoy the lecture format, but the reality is the lecture format doesn't actually teach us very much, and
No.
we know this. So what is it we think we're doing in the things that we are choosing to do.
Yeah.
That's I think the big question for me. So I'm great right now. I'm part of a church that does communion every week. That's the climax of the service. The teacher's brilliant, to his credit, and so he takes time. And there's an open questions and answer in part of it too, which I really love because it's kind of part of the idea of discipleship. None of that is possible in the same way with pre-recorded content delivery. None of it.
Yeah. What about the rest of the sacraments, like baptism?
Yeah.
And you could probably, this is something that really bugged me through the pandemic and the push to online. If it was maybe not through the pandemic, but like the desire to keep online as if it's just as valid prior to. It's just the idea of baptism, how that works as a church body participating in it. And the same thing with like weddings and funerals. I know they're not like sacraments in the same way, but like the
Right.
church's function in funerals being, like it's nice being able to live stream so family can get there and stuff like that. But when we were told that like that live stream, like this is the church doing it, same thing with weddings. Like the weddings thing really got to me too, because it's like
I
this
had
is,
no idea that happened. Wow.
yeah.
We went to an outdoor wedding in Canada during the pandemic.
Yeah, we did a few where it was where they were like 6 people in the room socially distant, and then live streams that everyone could go to, knowing that, yeah, when this drops, we're going to have the reception later or an outside reception later. But it was something weird about the whole thing, because like we were going to get to a point where it's like our function as a church is to marry people, and we're going to just push pause on that for like generations of people like who are trying to get married in the church and do the right thing, and now they can't. Like it seemed like this real touchy subject that never really got talked about, but
Yeah.
it is a function of the church. Like we don't marry people because the state needs someone
Right.
to
Yeah.
officiate that. We marry people because it's a covenant that mirrors what Christ does to the church.
Right.
And
I
so,
think in a society like Canada or the US, the significance of that is really, in my mind, we could argue existential, but I think
mm,
within culture and society, it is more unique or distinct to participants in Christian faith. So it is true that there are people who like want to get married in a church, but I think that's a double-edged sword when we play it within a society like Canada or the US too. And I think we've started to see that over the last 20
yeah.
years. But the thing for me that stands out with all of that, like baptism in particular, if we think of sacraments,
Yeah,
and
that was one. Like, how do you
I just
baptize
don't,
into a community of faith if they're not there?
well, the question behind that, and this is where, and actually N.T. Wright talks about this a lot, but the question behind that question, and are a lot of people take the answer for granted, and ironically take an answer which isn't particularly Christian for granted. The question behind that is, are humans a complex, interconnected creature,
Hmm.
or are humans a brain or a soul?
Mm,
Because if humans are a brain, then the idea that baptism can happen virtually through an avatar in the metaverse is plausible.
yeah,
If
but if they're a
humans are
soul,
if humans are just a soul and a brain, then the same argument could be made. So the real question behind it is the significance of materiality? What is the significance of being embodied?
right?
I would argue the Christian answer is very significant. That the resurrection of Jesus involves an empty tomb and a risen flesh.
Yeah.
There is a sense in which bodily resurrection is a Christian fundamental for a reason.
Hmm.
We are interconnected, complex beings. My personality might change significantly because I didn't eat lunch at the right time.
Yeah.
Like there's
Yeah,
something
totally.
just
Like switch your
embodiment.
office to decaf and find out who you really work for. Like,
Yeah,
yeah, like,
exactly. But most people and many Christians take the idea that reality, what's really real, is your brain or your soul, some construct between them, and
mm,
that just isn't the Christian answer. It's
yeah.
a Platonic answer, but it's not the Christian answer.
Where do you get that out of NT's stuff? Like
Oh, he talks
which
about that all the time.
Like,
That's like,
do you
yeah.
have any like articles or books in mind just
Well,
for
there's
the
actually a
research
really
aspect?
brief. He does a really brief. There's a podcast produced by Premier Christianity, which is the UK magazine.
Yep.
Justin Brierley runs it, I think. So there's an episode not too long ago, actually, where NT was asked about Platonic dualism, and really, we're talking about Neoplatonic dualism, but nevertheless, Platonic dualism. Um, and he does like a 15-minute bit on it, and it's really, really great. And he kind of
Hmm.
summarizes why this is so problematic. But if you look at the creeds, and my first big song was a creed song.
Hmm.
If you look at the creeds, bodily resurrection is identified explicitly for exact because they were trying to fight against Gnosticism at the time.
Yeah.
And Gnosticism is disembodied secret message truth, which
Hmm.
I think within evangelicalism and Protestantism broadly, but uniquely within evangelicalism, we've flirted with that all along.
Yeah.
And so yeah, if we're embodied, then dipping in water has some significance that Avatar in the metaverse doesn't.
Yeah. It the whole idea of like what happens with your body through your faith journey matters. The only time I ever really had to come to terms with it, our resident dean at college pointed out that Jesus came back with scars.
Yep.
It's like, yeah, so like, and this is a guy who had had cancer several
Yep.
times, had his face kind of scarred from that cancer, and
Yeah.
was not at all disturbed with the fact that that's what he was going to look like for eternity. It's like that's part of the journey, and that's part of who made him him. And
Right.
it was fantastic. Like, because yeah, you never think about it that way. If all you do is like the campy evangelical Christianity, where it's all about like what you think, what you feel, that kind of stuff. Like what you do with your body is important. So
Yeah. What you do with your body is important. And I would even say what you think and feel plays a role. So we need to be careful probably not to undervalue emotion, because we know even just physiologically, we know the absolutely essential role that emotion plays in choice making, for
yeah.
example. So, and we could unpack that if we want, but at the end of the day, like, we are complex creatures.
Hmm.
And while this isn't a theological statement, but more of a practical metaphor, um, I've often thought, there's something to the idea that God is Trinitarian and sort of creatorly and willful and embodied and also immaterial and all of these things as you look at the idea of Trinity. And yet here we are as human beings with a similarly complex relationship with our metaphysics and our own sense of self.
Yeah.
So I think we've had a probably too simple understanding of ourselves
Hmm.
within the Western tradition for a long time.
Do you think that comes from a lack of like good teaching and definition? Because one of the things that drew me to your content and why I wanted to have this conversation was you seem real particular on words, which is refreshing. I'm a big
Maybe too
stickler
much.
for like do not use that word unless it means like a big thing with the online church. Again, one of these, it's like a script was handed out, is everyone wants to dispel the myths of online church. I'm like, myths can only be wrong. That doesn't frame the conversation as this could be a misunderstanding or a misconception. No, the myths mean that the person uttering the myths are wrong
Well,
because myths aren't real, right?
I'd probably disagree with you only in the sense of, like, sociologically, that's not how myths are used. So if you look
Yeah,
at within the academy, you can talk about a myth that is true or false, and it actually isn't the point at all.
yeah,
And so that's, but either way, your point still stands that it's not really the academic application. Um,
yeah,
my hang up on words has more to do with communication than specificity, though. I think if I'm going to use a word and refuse to define it, then I'm responsible for the consequences of doing so. So let's
yeah.
take, for example, a hot word right now would be deconstruction.
Hmm.
Right? Their deconstruction is an academic word. It has an absolutely useful application within faithful Christianity.
Yeah,
However, in the zeitgeist, that word has, for all intents and purposes, been co-opted by those who, for intellectual doubt, which is understandable, or hurt, which is equally understandable,
yeah,
have said, I no longer wish to anchor my epistemology to the Christian faith, and I'm going to rebuild the thing from scratch.
Right. Yeah.
That's
No. It's and you could say the same thing like with critical, like theory, critical
critical
thinking,
race theory, right?
all
Yeah,
that stuff. Yeah.
it's like, of course this has a function, and but when we use the hot word, it's like there's a group of Christians, and I mean my own deconstruction, if you will, by which I mean the disassembly of ideas in order to examine which are idiosyncratic to the tradition I was raised in as compared to faithful to historic Christianity.
Yeah.
That is essential to discipleship. And that is technically absolutely a deconstruction. The problem is if we're talking in public discourse as opposed to in academic or legal discourse where one has the opportunity to define every term they're going to use, right? If we're
Yeah.
talking out loud in public and I use the word deconstruction, if 80% of my audience are going to hear that what I'm talking about is abandoning the Christian faith and anchoring my truth elsewhere, then I ought not use that word. I ought to say something else or say, hey, I'm going to say deconstruction, but when I say it, this is what I mean. And I think this is a problem in both Christian circles where folks have realized there are certain idiosyncratic beliefs with evangelicalism that aren't about orthodoxy, right? That aren't about sort of a broad historic Christian orthodoxy. Those exist. It'd be crazy to say they don't, right? And so because those exist, there are people going, well, that's not it. Then I'm going to say I'm deconstructing. No, you're not. You're a Christian who's saying, maybe I'm not as evangelical as I thought.
Yeah.
That's great. But that's equally a problem for the John Coopers of the world who are declaring war, which is completely inappropriate, on the idea of people who are asking good questions within contexts where abuses are happening.
Yeah.
Like, that's insane.
Yeah.
So we I'm particular about words in that we use them to create meaning. And if we don't, language changes over time. And if we're not intentional in saying, this is what I mean by this, then we end up creating all kinds of craziness. And I think in the space of worship, one of the places that has happened most interestingly has been around performance, because
I was just about to ask you, because that's one of the things. Your video on performance was perfect. Because it's like, that's what everyone's been missing. Because like, oh, it's just a big show. I'm like, well, no, you know, there's words. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think it's contextual, right? Like I use the metaphor, the analogy, I guess, of a wedding as opposed to a concert. And the truth is, there are times when I go and play a concert. People pay tickets to come see us play, and that's what we're doing. And we'll trick them into church a little bit in the course of the evening, right? But
evil laughter.
Yeah. But the corporate worship gathering is distinct from that thing. And that's really what we're struggling with, I think, you know, and the metaphor of the wedding is useful in my mind because yes, the presentation of a sermon is part of a wedding.
So it's more than just interpretations of that. It's meanings of the words and using them
exactly
so you can get there.
Yeah, exactly. And so when we talk about performance, we've created so much anxiety in young worship leaders coming up, end up with incredible stress about hand wringing about whether or not they're good, whether or not they're morally good and doing what they're trying to do by using the tools that make it easier for them to literally do it. And I think that's just an insane double speak that we need to cancel.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, totally. You had a great reel about the death and nuance that I think speaks into kind of this. Is that like, could you dig into that a bit deeper?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess so
because it can be kind of a rubber stamp. It's just like, oh, this needs nuance, and like, okay, well, what is? Are we actually using nuance, or are we just like, no, I don't want to talk about it?
Right, totally. Well, the same as like it's the same as the idea that, and I might get in hot water for this, but the idea that centrism means like holding the middle as the value. I'm probably within Canada, I'd probably be considered a centrist. Within the US, I'd probably be considered politically slightly left by default. But again, politically, not theologically, just to be very clear. But the reality there is that like I don't value the center. That's not the point. It's a question of where is it that my views flow from. And I think it's obvious why in an extremely noisy time I mean, the brain is essentially designed to reduce the use of energy and keep you alive.
Yeah.
So, and it reasons, and it sometimes reasons well, and it sometimes reasons poorly. I've run a marketing agency 15 years, and I've been reading books on the kind of physiology, neuroscience of decision making all of that time. And
Hmm.
the truth is, the sciences know a fair bit about this, and the reality is, most of our reasoning happens after the actual choice is made, and the choice is
Yeah.
made somewhat intuitively. And so if we are, we are drawn to the simplest explanation because a lot of what we are doing with our reasoning is justifying choices that we made
Yeah.
inside. And so if that's what we're doing, then I get why we lose nuance. The brain is like, what's the easiest thing I can grab onto that is an explanation that checks the most boxes at one time?
Yeah.
But the problem is, if we don't examine those for coherence with other things we think are important, we end up with a completely incoherent worldview and way of engaging culture and each other. And we hurt each other very, very badly.
Hmm.
And I think that where, at the very least, nuance requires a degree of kindness and a
Hmm.
degree of humility and a degree of listening that we're really not doing very well because we're all really, really tired.
You think that that could play into the provisional nature, at least in the last 2 years, of what online church gave us? That, like, yes, this requires a nuanced view of what church is, but provisionally it gives us that time, because, like, I think it'd be really easy to step back on certain sections of scripture and say it's just not church, therefore we shouldn't do it. In an age where it's like, this means your pastor's going to get arrested, like
Right. Yeah.
during like public health mandates,
Oh yeah.
or you could risk getting everyone really sick,
Oh, it's
or
it.
even just
I
like the
never
most
understood
vulnerable
that.
sick.
Yeah. I mean, geez, there are, I mean, you look at the Pentateuch, there are thousands of regulations and recommendations around which they have thousands of pages of commentary, right?
Hmm.
So like if you look at the Old Testament, and yet Jesus comfortably reduces it to
Yeah.
to the Shema. Love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, which means every domain of your life. And the second is like it, which I see as a bridging phrase. So the second is
Mhm.
like it, meaning these two things are kind of interconnected. You want to say you do this, you also do this,
Yeah.
right? Love your neighbor as yourself. I have not yet heard a persuasive case that running high risk, large gatherings in an exceptional event globally
Yeah.
is loving your neighbor, is loving God in such a way that doesn't put your neighbor
That
some.
doesn't break those apart.
I don't see how that could possibly be true. Now,
Yeah.
do I want that to be the norm? No, of course not. No,
Hmm.
and I don't think anyone does. But the reality that, loving our neighbor took precedence for a period of time over the instruction to gather, we literally wouldn't have most of the Old Testament if God wasn't constantly making concessions for the reality of earth as it is.
Right.
And so, like, in the New Testament is the same way, where Jesus is saying, well, since you are like you are, here's what you should do about it. And I
Hmm.
think that's exactly the same sort of thing that we saw play out with the pandemic. It's, since this is reality, we should do this for a time. And I guess what I struggle with is that it didn't seem as though in that time we were saying, why is this? What is it that we get here that what can we learn from this and take back with us into gathering again?
Yeah.
I, I don't think we've had a near enough robust conversation about that. Not in terms of reaching people online. I think that's a given.
Hmm.
I think of it more in terms of like, what does this tell us about what we may have prioritized wrongly prior and since coming back in terms of what the gathering is, like we started in the conversation?
Yeah. Um, so as it kind of moves on to that, what I've noticed is it's kicked into, probably just because the technology is available too, and now it's not as if the church is like as far back behind as they have been. Like, Metaverse came out last year. Life Church is doing Meta Church. Like, that's
Yep.
a turnaround.
Yep.
Like, so with that in mind, it's like, as we approach the virtual church, um, yeah, like, I'd love to hear your opinions on that, and see, like, how would that work? Like, if you could if you could do it, how would you do it? Like, where would you go for scriptural guidance or
Well,
theological
I
frameworks?
think it's
Or
significant that it's happening in non-denominational evangelical spaces, because I mean I jokingly call myself Anglicostal. Um,
Anglicostal.
I'm
You
I'm
are not the first person to tell me that phrase. That's great.
yeah. So but for me, for me, I think like I'm you know sacramental enough in my understanding, and probably comfortable enough with the sort of Christian mysticism, although I say that loosely, not in the sort of Richard Rohr to that sense. Um, I'm comfortable enough with all of that, that for me, I think there just really is something straightforwardly significant about we do this thing together if we can. And I worry it was already a bee in my bonnet for the last 20 years, the idea that we take that sort of disembodied Neoplatonic view of personhood for granted in the West. That already bothers me. I I already find that incompatible with traditional Christian orthodoxy.
Right.
And by that I mean just creedal orthodoxy, not even all of the things that have developed. I don't see how you get to this from there.
Yeah.
And so if that's the case, I mean, metaverse to me, metaverse church takes that for granted in a deep way, and takes for granted that what is happening is something like message delivery and the consumption of an individual experience of worship, if you will.
You think that
But
just comes from a lack of a framework to talk about that? Because
I do.
what I've seen is they want it to be church because they can see, like, if I meet this person in this meet this person in this virtual space and communicate with them, and they receive Christ through my proclamation of the gospel in this virtual space, well, I would do that at church. Like, why is that different?
And it's
you
true,
know
some of those lines are blurring, right? I mean, I have friends who I consider some of my closest friends who
Mhm.
I've predominantly talked to online.
Oh yeah, I've got through this process and like the pandemic, I've met a couple pastors online that I would consider like not close friends because like we've never done anything together, but like I know I could call them anytime, ask them questions.
Right.
I rejoice with them when they rejoice with, like, they post stuff online about their families and stuff like that. And it's this weird. You really do get to see how universal, because it can seem fractured Protestantism between like all our denominations. But like I've got like Bible thumping Baptist friends down south, and and like Anglicans, you name it, everywhere. Like they're all connected when you can connect through that medium, because it really just reduces it down to, you love Jesus? Oh, I love Jesus. Just
Yep, totally. Yeah, and I think in Canada we're a little more comfortable with the idea of being a largely post-Christian country, which
mm.
I actually controversially think of as having a good thing for the church. Um, which is a long story, but
Yeah, no, I can imagine.
yeah, but
Oh.
yeah. But I think like most Protestants in Canada are probably more comfortable these days with the idea of kind of an ecumenical spirit, considering
Mm.
Catholics and Orthodox and mainline to be Christian alongside them.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. Just knowing kind of the breadth of Christians that I know from, and like I've lived everywhere from New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, BC, Alberta, like Ontario, everywhere. All the Christians I know would not be as staunchly like everyone else is getting us wrong as I've seen some fundamental Southern Baptists,
Exactly.
where it's like,
Exactly.
oh, they use an NIV, they're obviously all going to hell,
Right.
like
Exactly. Yeah.
that no,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. Where it's just like, no, that's just how they do church, and this is how we do church.
Right.
Open hand, closed hand.
Well, and I think part of it too is like if you take for granted the sort of revivalist mentality, and by that I don't mean kind of early 19th century, but instead the like get them to say the sinner's prayer so that they are saved and in.
Mm.
If the question of that, if when you tease it all out, we're talking about a metaphysical question, and that is the only question that religion has to deal with. If
Yeah.
we take that for granted, then the things that we're talking about with meta church and so on, what's the difference?
Yeah.
If we're doing the sort of transactional
Mm.
disembodied, if we're answering disembodied questions, why would it matter that we're embodied? And I
Yeah.
think the thing for me has long been, if we see a conflict between the things that we seem to see scripture teaching us, or Paul or Jesus saying. And our practices, it seems to me it's more likely we have a misunderstanding of Paul. Like it's more likely that our practices are wrong and we have something more to learn within the context of the first century or so on
Right.
in order to say what is it that's going on. And this is one of those things to me where, you know, if you look at the Pharisees and the Sadducees, for example, the debate was not, does one, I mean, the debate was not, does one, is resurrection the point? The debate was, is there resurrection or not resurrection? The question of, does the soul go to heaven in between was not even really that crucial to them at all, to the point where Judaism has barely any, well, early Judaism, Second Temple Judaism has barely any understanding of the afterlife.
Hmm.
So if you look at that, you're like, well, we think since the Enlightenment that religion in general is answering a metaphysical question. Most of those who created these religions, and I don't mean created in
Yeah.
pejorative sense, I mean who developed the institutions and infrastructures around it and texts around it, very rarely was that the question they were asking.
Yeah.
So we understand religion as a narrow field,
Hmm.
and that just wasn't true until the Enlightenment. So Christianity, of course, comes to bear on the world, of course, comes to bear on my body, of course, comes to bear on my social community and the way that things are just or unjust within it. And it seems inevitable that that, you know, we're told constantly to do this, eat that, don't do it. Well, why would that be true if it was fundamentally about a disconnected experience? And so as I look around at a lot of American evangelicalism, that they still seem to be on some level, even if they don't realize it, taking that disembodied question for granted as the fundamental question of Christianity.
Right. I think that segues nicely because like when we're looking at like what does that authentic faith look like? Is that just, you know, thought? Is that just actions? Is it both? All that kind of stuff. It segues nicely into where I'm worried this is going to go. And as a fellow pseudo geek myself, like I write fiction too, and some of the projects I want to explore are like I'm really worried about what happens when we start putting people on other planets.
Right.
Strictly because it's like if you put 100 people on Mars, there's no way to get the gospel to them if the gospel doesn't go with them.
Hmm.
Right? It's like, and it will be a hell factory because they won't have the gospel, and they'll be self-sustaining population of people who never hear the good news. So like how does the gospel go there? Will it show up there unexpectedly? And exploring those possibilities is one.
Right. Right. Right.
But
Yeah.
the other one, and especially with Meta and like uh I witnessed it before the pandemic, actually while I was writing the first draft of the book, was the use of AI and
Mm.
how that's getting more and more prevalent in our lives, in our
Mhm.
interactions. There's AI novels being written now that are almost good. Like it's just this is clearly written by a robot, but like if I had nothing else to read, like this or the TV guide, then I'd probably still read this. Um, and what got me was like we've already stepped into this. Most people don't know. One of the projects I did when writing the book is I followed everyone I could on Twitter to see what Christianity was up to on Twitter, and a surprising amount of celebrity pastors had the exact same Twitter answer bot, down to the
Yeah.
script that would answer the same questions. I'm like, oh, we're too deep. That this was not covered in Bible college.
Yeah.
This is not a theological thing. Like, what is going on here?
Well, and
But that's what.
that's how I've felt in the worship space, honestly, is that every worship, not every, there are plenty of guys that are trying to think this stuff through, but we seem to be coming at a question which is fundamentally practical
Mm,
when it comes to worship leaders with theological answers as though the Bible is descriptive about things when it is not. And so that's like there are not, and I don't mean, you know, not quite the regulative principle versus not. That's really what I'm driving at.
hmm.
It's more just like, look, the idea of a worship leader, we are not a Levite within that second temple or earlier temple
Hmm.
structure. So at best we've got parallel and analogies. There's the answers that we have, in order to come to answers which ring true, we have to do more thinking than simply theological thinking,
Right.
because it's hard to extract from the text alone the answers we're going to need for how does one do the thing I do on a Sunday.
Yeah, because you couldn't reduce it to just what the text says and restrict it to just what the text gives you, because
No, certainly
nobody
not.
knows how to sing the Psalms to the tune of the lily.
No,
You
yeah,
know, as it's
and
straight
we're
in the
missing like
and
100 years of church history. Like
yeah,
we go from Acts to Justin Martyr, and most worship leaders didn't even know Justin Martyr existed. So like there's well maybe 40, 50 years. But anyway, my point is just that like there's a lot of like what was worship like that we simply don't know the answer to in the early.
right.
And so pretending we do is a little frustrating. And there's no, we were instructed to sing the Bible silent on why we should sing. And so to me, we look to philosophy and science, and we look to having a Christian worldview from which to enter those domains
Right.
in order to come to something like a useful answer as we stare down the next 20 years.
Yeah.
That's sort of my building block, to be honest, um, yeah, I have been frustrated over and over again that we seem to keep coming to the same reductive, answers as though the Bible answers questions. The Bible answers all sorts of questions, but there are questions it doesn't answer. So
Yeah.
now that we've built a framework, what do we do about those? AI is a great example. Space travel is a great example. The one pushback on the space travel question is simply this: um, we probably thought about continents around the world in exactly the same way.
Yeah, that's where I'm going to go with a lot of the early missions, especially to New World, like Puritans, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
When I want to talk about that, see if I can weave those themes into any fiction works I write. Because yeah, I know there's framework, and we probably missed it not thinking it would get there. And I think if we could keep up the way Life Church is trying to keep up with Meta Church on this theological curve, and really hunker down, and I'm not suggesting by any stretch I'm going to do it, but like develop on how would you approach technology and technological application from a theological lens, so that when the new thing comes out, like when
Yeah.
transhumanism isn't just something that Elon's talking about, but something that has to be dealt with because, like, in the middle of
Fair.
church service, your members are getting hacked.
Yep.
Like, and it's just wild to think that, but it's like it is happening. Like every
Yep.
time we think something science fiction, somebody does it. You
Yep.
know, it's
Given enough time.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, I think for me, one of the period makes me think of the kind of early medieval or pre-medieval period in the UK, which Vikings and Last Kingdom and these sorts of shows have covered.
mhm,
That's probably actually the period in history at which the church was pretty decent at cultural synthesis,
mm,
where they were kind of participated in foreign lands and became vital in the way that Judah in captivity was to Babylon. And I think
yeah,
that kind of post Constantine period up until 1066 or whatever, that is a period where in the British Isles at least that seemed to be what the church was doing. They were
yep,
participating in culture. They were kind of essential to and looking for ways in which holiness existed, and looking for ways in which there were cultural practices which were problematic and could be redeemed, and that sort of thing. And that sort of missional view, I think, is part of what I think the Canadian church has had to learn, particularly in big urban centers. And
mhm.
I think that's a really healthy thing. I think that, but that thinking of the planetary stuff, that early medieval Viking thing,
Oh
the,
yeah, like show
the
up
way
to
that
this
that's
country.
communicated.
Like I wondered how stuff like Boniface would show
Yeah,
up on Mars, and
yeah,
in a Christian context where like missionaries just show up, with a bunch of Bibles and nuke their power plant,
yeah.
just trying to play it out of like, jeepers, we're going to get there eventually.
Yeah.
There's already a Tesla Model S on its way there, so
That's
like we're going to be there. We really need to figure this out.
yeah.
Uh, but the AI thing, I think, because you could use it to misrepresent yourself, which I think that's where the Bible hits the road on that. It's like you are saying something and doing another thing. You are misrepresenting yourself to your neighbors, even like the like explicit Christian instruction on not doing this that doesn't even have to touch the fact that it's technologically based.
Right.
So I was real shocked at who did it. I won't drop names because
Yeah,
that would be
sure.
rude. But it was just like, goodness, we're doing this. Okay.
Yeah.
And so that's what
Well,
got me to write the book. And then we entered into with the whole live streaming and live church thing. And I was like, we're doing this again. This is a book that either is never going to get finished, and I don't want to start a podcast on this.
Yeah, totally.
Maybe I have to. So
But it's tough too, because I think like the dualism question, in the West, we have such an embrace of radical individualism that we think of, and this might be a pushback on what you were just saying, actually, just for fun.
Yep.
This, we have such a radical embrace of individualism that our view of authenticity is such that we essentially mean to be real, true to oneself. The problem is that's not how the first century would have looked at the idea of authenticity at all. They would have looked at it as integrity, and they would have looked at the relationship between an individual person in their community as much, much more interconnected than we do. So we think a community arises out of individual approaching it. And most cultures around the world historically have thought the individual arises from the community.
Yeah, I've commented on that, and it's something I'm still kind of working through, because what the admission that we're going to do church online, I think, authorizes is that what we define as church, what we define as community, starts with how an individual defines it on either end. So it's license on one end and participation on the other end, and it's not actually what the thing is, it's what they define it. And it's like, you take that principle to anything else, and that is just logic driving you towards your sin of choice. Because you could say the same, this is a bit explicit, but you could say the same thing about sex with a condom on. It's like, we're going to talk about how you can say, oh, it doesn't count as real sex. Why? Because there's a barrier in the way, and it's literally a barrier in the way. It's like, well, it was real community when there was a barrier in the way. I'm just going the other direction now.
Right.
And it's like, if we get there, we're not going to have the logical framework to take our theological principles and really disciple people into healthy situations. And I don't know if that'll get out that way. And maybe I'm overthinking it because, the giant library of theological books that keeps me awake at night.
I think
but if it gets there, it's like, oh, well, like, what are you going to do to a youth group when that becomes the thing that you have to fight against? And it's not just, your issue du jour, when it's something that you practiced and now have to go against,
totally. Yeah. Well, and I think that's where nuance comes into play. And it's really hard. I think it's really hard to, within a sort of strict fundamentalism where everything is reductive, right? It's really hard to live a real life in the world. And we end up, when we promote cultures like that, we end up creating cognitive dissonance. And eventually people tire of that and feel forced to make a choice that wasn't even a necessary choice. It was our own binary views which produced this dissonance.
Right.
And so I think that is often the case with stuff like that, like the example you gave, where, well, it's not as simple as, well, there's a barrier, so it wasn't real. We can't really reduce it to that. We can say, well, there are all kinds of things at play, and a lot of them will say that this was happening. So the case can be made. Can you make community online? Of course you can make community online. Can you connect with other humans? Yes. No. Is there something missing in not making eye contact? Also, yes. Is there something in singing, which, and this is really unique to worship, is there something in singing along to a television that feels considerably less satisfying physiologically? I'm thinking oxytocin at this point, than singing in a room with people, dramatically so.
Yeah. Like, I came to our church, which is a pretty large church. We do 1,000-person services, multiple services on the weekend, that kind of thing. And I come from smaller churches, like 300-person. I was a youth pastor at about a 200-person church at one point. Like, our church back in New Brunswick was like 150 people with no microphone, a really loud Pentecostal preacher.
Right.
And that kind of thing. And one of the things that drove me to the church just to go, because I work as the facility manager here. I don't need to go to the church. One of the things that I loved about the church is I sat down and the worship department didn't silence the drums. They do they did a real good job of making sure that the mix is appropriate for what they're trying to do. Because, like, why have a drum kit if you're not going to do it? It's like, I can feel the drums in my chest. It's not a punk concert where it's, it's like, but the drums aren't just there, they're everywhere. And
Right.
that visceralness is like, that's just as much a part of worship as the words we're saying, as the seat you're in,
Oh
as
yeah.
the people raising their hands beside you. And it's like, you lose all of that online, but what you gain is this thing that the person who's too scared to come to the big scary church also now is testing it out beforehand, connecting with a member on the chat, in the chat sessions,
Yep.
like in a safe person. You get this wider net with bigger holes.
Yep. It's
And
a
it's like,
great,
I
it's
don't
a
want to
great
lose
on
that.
ramp. It's a great door.
Yeah.
But if it is the substitute, it's really bad.
Yeah. And I think that's the only thing really missing, is like, if we could start declaring this stuff as it's a door, not a, not a roof,
Yep.
it
Not an
would,
alternative. Yeah.
yeah, it would really, like, the kind of thing, like, stuff goes viral. And that's one of the main points I make in the book. And one of the things I got right, it's like, stuff goes viral. Can you imagine the kind of revival that could have happened if Billy Graham had Twitter? Like, that kind of stuff. It's like, it's going to happen. That this is
Yeah.
not happening for a reason. God is just as much a part of the internet as he
Yeah.
was of the printing press. And the
Yep.
internet is just, categories more powerful than the printing press ever
Oh
was.
yeah. Totally.
So yeah.
Yeah. It's
um
early days in it all, I guess.
yeah, I don't want to take too much of your time, but I did have two questions from our
Sure.
worship pastor, because, like, I realized the facility manager might not be the best guy or to
That's amazing.
ask questions of a guy like yourself. So he wants to know, how have you seen, or if you've seen ways to move people from an online experience to in person, and what are the metrics, if you've seen any that kind of work? Like, what does that look like?
Man, that's the $1 million answer right now. I mean, churches all over the place up until even.
Yeah, well, even just an opinion, like, what do you think it might be?
Yeah. I think in all communication, consistency is key. Being much more repetitive than you think you need to, making clear what. So Seth Godin is this marketing guru who talks about how a lot of behavioral economics can be reduced to, and some sociology can be reduced to one simple sentence.
That's Tribes guy, right?
Yeah, that's the Tribes guy.
Yeah. Okay.
The sentence is, people like us do things like this.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at your church and you think, what are people like us? How would we understand who we are? And then what do those people do? And do we communicate that people like us do things like this? Then I think we stand a chance over the long haul of people who feel as though they belong to this community online, feeling as though being there in person is a legitimate and crucial part of being a part of this community.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not to say that, I mean, there is a degree to which churches have tried to sort of apologize for being, not actually, no, they've tried to sort of say these two things are equally valuable choices, make your choices, like as if what they're doing is some sort of consumptive option.
Mm-hmm.
And I have empathy for and sympathy for people who have been sick or are high risk, and I get all of that,
Mm-hmm.
but those are exceptions to the rule. In generally speaking, for most human beings who are in bodies, there's something beneficial to what we do in person that is more difficult to do virtually.
Yep.
So we've made concessions out of love for neighbor for a long time, and that's great. But as where it's appropriate to say our community is a community that gathers, here's what it looks like, here's what you get out of that. I think you would need to be saying that every week, and it would need to be coming from the pulpit on a regular basis. I think there's very little that the worship leader can do
Yeah.
without to shape that experience. That's a top-down church messaging question.
Yeah. And then we probably covered this in aggregate, but, like, how do you hold the definition of corporate worship in a time of that hybrid nature of we're doing it in the big room, but it's also online for the people staying at home, as if that's one big body? Like,
Yeah.
what is that, how do we hold to that as corporate when there is definitions? Like, there's separation, but communication through those separations.
Well, I mean, ultimately, my belief is that we sing to create atmospheres of prayer, corporate prayer. That's why music is the thing, and I mean, there's been a big push for like dance and visual arts and all of these different things. And
Flag waving,
I'm pretty involved in the visual arts, to tell you the truth. I have a couple of companies in that space. But the reality is, like, those are not fundamentally corporate, as in group activities. Singing is group singing, given that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
Fundamentally corporate. It is a unifying experience where you are engaging your whole body and then you are doing it together. Your heartbeat aligns, your body produces oxytocin like you're holding your own baby. Incredible things happen in group singing. And
Mm-hmm.
so in my mind, like, the experience of corporate prayer is the function of musical worship.
Yeah.
So the online thing, that is possible. It is possible for us to have a concert of prayer online. Is it the same? No, it's not the same.
It was one of the things I noticed that viscerally I missed the most was collective voice singing, because
Mhm.
it was like a year before you
Mhm.
heard it again.
Yep.
And it's like I never realized, like, choirs have kind of gone the way,
Yep.
like, and my mom's church was Presbyterian, and they had a choir, and I remember every week singing "Holy, Holy, Holy,"
Yep.
and that song just powerfully connects to me whenever it does. And it's like we don't realize that till it's gone, how powerful it was. That when
Totally.
you're in a church of, a couple hundred to 1,000, and the choir's around you and you're a part of it, that's something that's encouraged and visceral.
Yep.
So
Totally.
yeah.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more.
um Two last questions, real quick ones. What are you reading right now? I always ask people that because I'm a book guy. So
Oh my gosh. Where is it? You know what? I just posted about it on Instagram. There's a book that I just actually just finished it, and it is okay. There's a book called American Cosmic, which
never heard.
is
Yeah.
a religious studies professor who hangs out with UFO true believers for several years.
So
And so
I will have to
it
check
is,
that out.
it has a twist at the end. It is a great, great, great book. And really interesting in terms of, like, the applications are really fascinating because huge interactions with Catholicism. She's studied Catholicism in most of her career. But the really fascinating thing is kind of the role of social contagion and belief in everyday interactions in
Mm.
society and how we engage that. And making it a UFO question just makes it possible to examine from afar in a really fascinating way. I think you'll love the ending. Let's say that.
Cool. I'll check that out. And then I try to end most of my interviews this way, just because I end up talking with pastors and worshipers and stuff. What can I be praying for you during this time, like in the next
Oh
couple weeks
man,
and stuff?
I mean,
I try to bring that always in. So.
yeah. No, to be totally honest, we have 5 kids, and the pandemic for a lot of families.
I notice you have all your hair still. Good job.
I do. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. I think the pandemic, for all of us was really hard. It brought a lot with it, and, was a powder keg for issues that might have been inconsequential otherwise. And I
Yeah.
think our kids have been amazing as we kind of try to process that together with them. It was hard. And so I think praying for my family in that, and praying for all families, really, just parents who are having to unpack a essentially collective traumatic experience
Yeah.
without any of the training.
Yeah, no, it's definitely popping up, and I've been blessed that our church is really focused on that. All of our staff stuff been focused around mental health
Mhm.
and healthy spiritual rhythms, that kind of stuff, and it's been great because, yeah, I think it's around the 6 month mark, as this stuff really started to affect me. I'm like, whenever this ends, oh gosh, is it going to be a mess? Like, so. Yeah,
Yep.
no, totally. We will definitely keep you in prayer. And
Awesome.
yeah, I appreciate your time. I don't want to keep you too much longer. We're a couple minutes over now. So
No, it's great. I really appreciate it, Mike. This was a lot of fun.
yeah, you too. We'll talk to you later.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
Later.